Yo, what's going on guys, Khraze here, welcome back to another Ghost of Tsushima video, and today let's go over the best and the worst classes in the Legends mode, though take worst with a grain of salt because there's no really worst class in here in the true sense of the word, because most of them are going to be absolutely capable at pretty much anything that the Legends co-op mode is going to throw at it. Maybe before the raid I would have said that the Assassin feels a bit behind everybody, simply because its main skill, which is the assassination, kinda doesn't seem to scale off with the enemy's HP that much, and it still doesn't to this day, but because they are so useful in the raids, they kinda compensate for all of that. So let's discuss about this, starting with, of course, my main class right now, and my favorite basically, which is none other than the Samurai. Now, going over the pros and the cons, this is probably going to be the most sustainable and persistent class right now from the entire lineup, simply because it has an uptime on the battlefield of at least 95%, assuming that of course you have a proper build, and that is in part thanks to all of its healing mechanics and ways of leeching HP from the enemies while still getting healed while doing damage, mainly from its Siphon ability, and then of course the Blasted Strike perk on its class charm, which together make an amazing combination. It's one of the best combos in the game at simply staying alive all the time, dealing damage, and not having to care one bit about almost any incoming damage, maybe with the exception of a few relative mechanics here and there. Now, because of this amazing healing combo, it's also one of the best, if not the only class that can make proper use of the Moon Stance that I've talked about in the past, of course combining it with the Master perk. Now, you probably don't know about this, or maybe you did watch my previous videos, but Moon Stance has a really amazing advantage, simply because you can do those kind of spins with a triangle 3 times with the Master perk, which means you can slice everybody around you in a 360-degree radius, but at the same time deal way higher damage than any other stance, and also completely bypassing about 99% of the shields. This normally on a different kind of class would put it in severe danger, because during that spin you kinda don't get staggered at all, so this is going to be really difficult for you to feel the feedback of incoming damage, which means that you're going to have a much harder time to dodge and avoid incoming damage. But because you don't care about that, since you're constantly healing also on damage hits, it means that you can just stay there in the middle of the fight and just spin around baby until everybody is dead. Now, this doesn't mean that the class doesn't come without any weaknesses. Probably one of its biggest weaknesses is the fact that it doesn't really come with any big burst damage outside of its ultimate, and even in that case there's other classes that can do burst damage way better inside of their ultimates, that sometimes can even one-shot even Oni enemies. So this means that in situations where you have to take down high value targets really fast, especially the linked ones, you might suffer from this issue, especially since the ultimate cannot be controlled, so it can randomly jump off to a different target, which means you can completely lose your burst onto the primary one. Also, on the same note, it's one of the more selfish kind of classes in the game, as in it doesn't really offer any particular party-wide buff or benefit like the other classes can do. It's basically full on for itself, but even in that case it still does it all amazing. Now, this brings us to probably its complete opposite, which is none other than the Ronin, which is actually exactly what you will need in your party, especially in your raids. It's probably one of the most important classes that you will need in any raid that you're doing at any point, maybe with the exception of chapter 3. Its biggest use comes from its healing capabilities, especially the party-wide healing capabilities coming from the incense plus, for example, a range extender, or maybe from the spirit animal plus the spirit healing, which is going to do pretty much the same, except in this case you have a creature that can also disable one target, which in the raid can be just absolutely amazing. So really useful over there if you roll it like that. And let's not forget about the fact that the ultimate is probably the best party-wide ability that you can get in this game right now, especially with the 18 level perk that can also sustain your entire party, maybe through some damage phases. Maybe there's an incoming damage on all of the party members, you can just use that preemptively even if nobody is dead, for the healing over time that everybody will get at the same time. But let's not forget about the fact that you also get access to probably the best AoE tool in the game, which is the bomb pack, and with the proper combinations of perks and whatnot, you can literally destroy entire groups of enemies. Now, some of the downsides of this class, and trust me, I kinda struggle to find any, are the fact that, of course, outside of your bomb pack, which you can easily burn through, you don't really have any AoE capabilities. Well, maybe unless you want to spec into an ultimate that also burns enemies, but that is not really ideal. And it's also very easy to kinda use an entire bomb pack and not really take down an entire group if you don't know what you're doing, and even more so if you're missing. And of course, let's not forget about the fact that some of the healing setups might be quite item dependent, like especially the healing spirit with the spirit animal, which will require a class charm, a ronin class charm, to actually do that. The next one is going to be the assassin, also my former main that I've used momentarily, but then I switched to the samurai and the ronin after a few, let's just say, days of playing the Legends mode. Now, it does come with some really big benefits that have been even more important in the raid mode, and this is because this class has the most amount of access to stealth related mechanics and abilities, like especially assassinations, vanishes, smoke bombs, and so on and so forth. So as I've said in a previous video, in many raid situations you don't even need to complete a challenge by killing enemies, you only need to reach a certain point, like especially in these pillar related challenges where you have to kind of transport a pillar to a gate. In that situation, it's way more beneficial and faster to distract enemies, and in this case there's no better class to do that than the assassin, because you have access to a group vanish from your skill tree. You also have access to, of course, those smoke bombs, but you can also refresh your vanishes if you kinda manage to fully assassinate a target. So you can potentially go in and kinda go fully invisible through an entire level by just doing this if you know your setup. But there's other advantages in there too, like for example the ultimate kind of feels similar to the one that the samurai has, except in this case you can pick and choose your target, which means that burst damage on the main target is going to be very easy. And let's not forget about the fact that, yeah, you can also use the blowgun, and hallucination is going to be absolutely amazing on the nightmare mode, especially against Onis when you want to provide distraction or use enemies against each other. But as I've said, this class comes with quite a few cons that can make or break the game for you, and especially so I will refer to the stealth mechanics and the assassination damage. The problem here is that in many situations, if you press a button too early while you are stealth, you can easily miss your assassination window, and this means that your character is just going to do regular damage onto the enemy, which means you cannot re-assassinate them unless you cast another form of vanish or smoke bomb again. And this also extends to the assassination damage. Sometimes it just feels that it doesn't scale properly with the enemy's HP, so even though you might be fighting a regular sized enemy, you might just deal like 3/4 of its HP, even though in theory and by the looks of it and from your build you should more than be able to kind of take it down in only one hit. And on the same note, I would also say that many of the assassin mechanics kind of depend on you one-shotting an enemy with the assassination, which, as I've said, on Nightmare it's not always, if not ever, going to be possible. This brings us to the final class, which is none other than the Hunter. It's also like the last one that I've played with. Now, I will say that this is one of the more OP damage dealers currently in the game. I'm not really sure if it's the highest burst damage dealer, but I'm pretty sure it's pretty close to that. And that comes especially from the really high bow damage, especially with the skipping stone legendary. If you're like super lucky to get this is probably gonna be like the best one out there in the game for damage, for anything you want to. It also like benefits many of your builds and many of your technique points, because it skips like to an additional target when you're doing a headshot, which means that if you have any headshot abilities, like for example ones that refund arrows on headshots, you can get more arrows back than you're shooting, and that just means that you can constantly go on without ever needing to reload. I would say that its ultimate is also one of the craziest in the game, especially with that skipping stone bow, and even more so because you're targeting multiple heads at the same time automatically, but because you have the skipping stone, each of these enemies individually bounce headshots from one another, which can can result in, well, yeah, you just one-shotting multiple Onis at the same time, not just one of them, and that's something that no other class in the game can currently do. But in terms of cons, I would say that out of all of the classes, this is probably gonna be the one that is most gear dependent. Not only do you need access to the best legendary in the game, you also need access to a class charm with the perk that refunds arrows on headshots. And I would also say that if you get run down by the enemies, or if you get surrounded and you can't go too far away from them, you're kinda like an easy target that only has access to maybe the sword abilities and maybe a smoke bomb if you thought of bringing that with you. So yeah, as you can see, ranking all of these classes can be quite difficult. I would say that when it comes to just soloing story nightmare, maybe the hunter and the assassin could be some of the best in the game, and immediately followed by the samurai, which has a lot of sustain. But otherwise, if you were to judge simply by how many of these classes are required in how many pieces of content, like especially on nightmare, we would probably place the ronin first, since it's needed literally in survival and the nightmare raid as well. It is absolutely mandatory over there, immediately followed of course by the samurai in the same pieces of content, since this is a tank that can distract all of the enemies around you. And then I would split it between the hunter and the assassin depending on which of the raid chapters we would go on to. So if it is chapter 1 and 2, probably I would roll with an assassin, since I found this party combination to be way better. And if it were to be chapter 3, then I would probably go with the hunter finally in the raid mode too. But this is it with the ranking. Of course, just my opinion, you don't have to like rely on it. I just gave you the pros and the cons. Let me know down below which is your main class for which piece of content. In the meantime, thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to comment, like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.